Hi everyone. Today we are continuing the module on extended family. This particular set of lecture slides examines some theories that help us better understand our relationships with extended family, especially our relationships between grandparents and grandchildren. So for the next couple of slides, we're really going to be looking at communication accommodation theory, the socio-emotional selectivity theory, and the intergenerational stakes hypothesis. So let's start. Let's take a look at communication accommodation theory. If you've taken any other communication classes, you may already be familiar with this theory. It's usually discussed when you are talking about intercultural communication. So if you've taken intercultural communication or maybe just taken comm theory, it was within that particular intercultural unit. So in some ways, by applying this theory to extended family, we're really kind of talking about the idea that when grandparents and grandchildren communicate, it's almost like people from two different cultures are communicating with each other. In general, the idea behind communication accommodation theory, or CAT, is that when people communicate with others, they tend to change their style of speech. And they do so in a way that accommodates or makes it easier to understand for the other person that they're interacting with. There are a lot of different ways that we might accommodate our communication. We might change our style of speech. For example, one way that we might change our style of speech is simply what we talk about, right? The topics of conversation may vary. My guess is if you think about what you discuss with your college roommates or your fraternity brothers or sorority sisters or your teammates, and you think about those topics, those things that come up with the conversations with those people, and then you think about the things that you discuss with your parents or your boss or maybe your professor, probably there's some different topics there, right? There may be some overlap, but my guess is you alter your topics based on the audience. Right now, maybe a really good example of that might be thinking about politics. I was actually just kind of having a conversation with someone, and she was talking about how her sister-in-law and their family has very different political views from herself. And so she was kind of talking about they're getting ready to go on a vacation together, and she was thinking about how they actually change kind of the TV programs that they typically watch when they vacation together because they know that they actually tend to usually watch very different types of shows. So in that case, they are kind of accommodating each other. Okay, other ways to accommodate the types of words that you use. You know, that might be the fact that you might use some profanity, or you might use some type of slang, or even just some kind of inside jokes when you are talking with some people, but on the other hand, you might avoid those very same words when you're talking to other people. You could think about it with a classroom setting, right? In class, we might use certain terminology or vocabulary that's relevant to our textbook or our communication theory, but you might not use those same complex words or terminology when you were outside of class. So certainly altering the actual words you use is a way of changing your style of speech. How fast you speak or your rate of speech might vary depending on who you're speaking with, and even your accent might change. I know that I have some family that live down south, and I have noticed that when I go visit them and then I come back, it's almost like I have developed or kind of picked up a little bit of a southern accent that's kind of lingered with me. So there are a wide range of ways that we might accommodate our communication based on who we're interacting with. Kind of the takeaway message here then from this slide is the idea that I think you can call communication accommodation, or you can think of communication accommodation similarly to how you think of audience analysis in public speaking, right? I know you've all taken some amount of public speaking, whether that was COM 105A or COM 105B, and a really big important part of public speaking that comes up in those classes is how important it is to know your audience and understand your audience, and then try to think about how your message can be kind of tailored to your audience. So that's at a public speaking level. Communication accommodation theory really asks us to kind of do the same thing or think about the same things, but it's at an interpersonal level. So I don't know about you, but that really helps me to think about this theory. It's really a lot like audience analysis, just on a one-on-one kind of interpersonal level. So When you are engaging in accommodation, the theory argues that sometimes you might over-accommodate, other times you might under-accommodate, and sometimes you might find kind of an appropriate amount of accommodation. When we over-accommodate, that's typically perceived negatively. I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but basically it's the idea that if you think that you need to slow down your speech because you are speaking to someone who, let's say, does not speak English as their first language, so you slow down your speech to accommodate them, help them understand you, but it turns out that you really are speaking much more slowly than what they need you to be in order for them to understand you. That's really over accommodation, right? And you can maybe think about how someone might respond to that. Maybe you can think about how you feel when you feel like someone is over accommodating you in a way that's really not necessary. On the flip side, under accommodation simply involves not making any kind of necessary changes. One example I think of that comes to mind right away on this one is perhaps have you ever sat in a class before and you've been trying to pay attention and trying to listen to the professor, and that professor happens to be speaking quickly or happens to be speaking about very complex material that you don't understand and that you are not familiar with. And even if you or other students ask questions, the answers are still extremely complex and kind of over everyone's head, but the professor really never adapts or changes his or her way of teaching. That would be an example of under accommodation. And then again, of course, we have appropriate accommodation. Now, in addition to levels of accommodation, the theory also talks about convergence versus divergence. Convergence simply refers to when we change our style of speech in a way that is more similar or more alike to the person that we are communicating with. So you find yourself speaking with someone who has a Southern accent, and now all of a sudden you start hearing yourself use a Southern accent and maybe using a Southern drawl. On the other hand, divergence occurs when we change our style of speech so that it actually creates a space or separation from the person that we're interacting with, and actually makes us feel more different from that person. So both of these concepts suggest that our communication can help us to either feel more a part of a group and closer to someone, or can distance us from a group or feel more separate. One example that I always think of when I think of divergence is when I go and I go to the salon for a pedicure. So I have a place that I don't go all that often, but when I do go, it's operated by a Vietnamese family, and English is not their first language, or at least the stylist that I typically see. And so I go, I sit down, we say hello and ask each other how we are, and then it doesn't take long until the stylist starts speaking with her coworkers, not in English, right? And I'm always a little paranoid because I have not so attractive feet. I'm always a little paranoid with just what they might be saying, but really what they are doing by speaking in a language that they know I don't know is creating divergence, right? Creating separation, right? I don't need to know about what they're talking about, and they know, and by speaking a language that I don't know, that enables me not to know what they're speaking about, right? It's creating divergence. So even, an example of you telling an inside joke with one friend in a group of larger people and the other people don't know, that inside joke, that type of communication is an example of divergence, right? Using communication to create separate groups, create space. Okay. So what are some of the results that the theory predicts comes from these efforts to accommodate, as well as these efforts to converge and diverge? Well, generally speaking, we know a lot of positive outcomes come from accommodation, right? When you are interacting with someone who appears to be changing their style of speech to kind of accommodate you, then it feels like, okay, they're trying to establish rapport with me, right? It's a way that they're signaling that they like me, that they're trying to find common ground, and it usually enhances relationship satisfaction. It's perceived really positively. However, as I mentioned previously, sometimes when we try to accommodate, we over-accommodate. When we feel like someone is over-accommodating us, then it can really be perceived as condescending. We can feel like we're being patronized, right? And let me just give you one example of that. So there was a study that was done that looked at individuals living in nursing homes or assisted living homes, and they examined the interaction between these individuals and their caregivers who worked at the facility. And what they found was that the caregivers did engage in some accommodation. And so early on, they didn't really notice any differences in how the patients interacted or spoke. But the longer the patients had been there, they found that the patients actually started to have decreases in their self-confidence, self-esteem, and some other variables. Basically, the patients felt like they were being young children, right? And they thought that the caregivers were speaking loudly and slowly and really over-accommodating them. And so the patients then started to question their confidence. They thought, well, I think I know what's going on, and I feel like I understand everything, and I feel like I am participating just as I have always been. But because they were continuously being spoken to in a way that they perceived as kind of patronizing and condescending, they started to question their own competence and thought, well, maybe I am missing something, or maybe I do need them to be speaking so slowly to me. So that's certainly a kind of interesting and unfortunate repercussion in that case of over-accommodation. Okay, but so for the exam, you'll definitely need to be familiar with the concept of communication accommodation theory, be able to talk about the different ways that you might engage in accommodation, as well as some of the outcomes associated with the different levels of accommodation. Our next theory that looks at the grandparent-grandchild subsystem is the social-emotional selectivity theory. The main idea behind this theory is that as people age, their preference for social contact and social partners change. And your book provides kind of a nice chart to help us visualize these changes in our preferences for social interaction. The two major concepts that the theory looks at are our preferences for emotional connection or regulation and our preference for information seeking. And so when you look at the chart there, what you can see is ultimately as we age, specifically as we approach end of life, we tend to prioritize emotional connections and we tend to minimize our need for information seeking or knowledge. You can see that the lines aren't necessarily just strictly straight lines, that instead there's kind of peaks and valleys there. The idea would be that, let's look at the knowledge piece first, or the information seeking. The theory would predict that information seeking preference is highest right around late adolescence and then kind of into early adulthood. And if you think about what are some of the things that are going on during that stage in life, it makes sense to think why people are really focused on the information seeking behaviors, right? Probably in that stage of life, you are trying to find a college, you may be trying to find a job or a career, you may be doing a lot of networking just to simply get interviews for jobs and careers, right? So you're probably really focusing on a lot of weak ties or a lot of connections, right? A lot of quote unquote friends on Facebook or followers on some other social media site in order to collect all kinds of information about where you might find that job, about how you might find someone who also needs a roommate to stay with in Grand Rapids, or whatever that might be. Right? That's really important at that stage of life. As you then age, right, and maybe settle into a career, settle into a location to live, settle in with a romantic partner or what have you, right, then you can see the need for these weak ties and all of these connections and all this information seeking goes down. And then the theory predicts that instead, you really start to prioritize the emotional connection of your social relationships. So you may be much less concerned about having 1,000 friends on your social media site, but instead you become quite concerned with the few very close friends you have or the very close sibling relationship that you want to maintain. And all of a sudden those the kind of quality over quantity takes over in terms of your relationships. Okay, one more theory to look at here, and one more idea here to look at is the intergenerational stakes hypothesis. The intergenerational stakes hypothesis suggests that when you look at the grandparent-grandchild subsystem, ultimately grandparents are more invested. And I encourage you to maybe think about that for a few minutes. Why would grandparents be kind of more invested in the relationship than grandchildren, right? There are probably a variety of reasons. One explanation might be just simply kind of genetic, right? And when we talked about romantic partners and mate selection, we talked about the power of evolutionary psychology and our desire to kind of pass down our genes. So some of that might be influencing grandparents' investment in their grandchildren. In addition to that, we can think about some of the expectations associated with the role of grandparent versus the expectation of the role associated with grandchild. Grandparents probably feel some obligation to be kind of a pillar of wisdom, to be a teacher, to share information and pass down knowledge. I don't think children necessarily feel that obligation in the same way. Probably a variety of additional explanations, but that's certainly something interesting to kind of think about. If we know that grandparents tend to be more committed to, more invested in, and perceive more closeness in the grandparent-grandchild relationship, just how does that affect kind of the interaction between grandparents and their grandchildren on a regular basis, and how might that influence the behaviors of each person in the relationship? Okay, anyway, at this point, we have covered kind of these couple of theories and main ideas regarding grandparent-grandchildren interaction.